All right. I'm Jessica Kerr, and I get to moderate a little bit as Gergely Orosz from the Pragmatic Engineer and Charity Majors from Honeycomb are talking about managing costs in a vendor-dependent world. All right. Yes, there's some.
Are you still doing housekeeping, Jess?
Nope, we're good. You can talk.
All right. Thanks for the introduction. How did you pronounced Gergely's name so well? I'm like Gergely, like an American. How did you say it, Jess?
Gergely Orosz, right?
Gergely Orosz.
No, I told
Yeah, she pronounced it like Hungarian.
That sounds a lot better. Well, my name is Charity. I am CTO and co-founder, and I'm sure all of you know my friend here, but I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself.
Yeah, and hi everyone. I'm Gergely. So I write the Pragmatic Engineer newsletter. Beforehand, I was a software engineer for about 10 years, engineering manager for another 5. So I'm gonna be, I guess, representing more of the software engineer slash engineering side. And it's interesting because we talked with Charity before, and we're going to get into this, but the whole vendor story is very interesting because a lot of engineers, like a lot of you are software engineers here, but the typical engineering journey I've seen, I've kind of been on is first you're an engineer, you build cool stuff, you build products, and then after a while you start to get a little bit tired of building products. And I've kind of been on the platform side where you go over to be a platform engineer, where I haven't been, but I probably would have been after a while, is become a vendor because you realize like, oh, it's so tiring to work inside a company trying to do all the politics. So the point is, even if you're a software engineer and you're like, oh, I hate vendors, or I don't like them, or I don't think I have anything to do with them beyond buy something from them, one day you might become a vendor, because the best software engineers that I see get so frustrated with the state of things that they become one. And that's kind of the story of Honeycomb and Charity. And I actually met Charity way before, or like right around when I think they started. But Charity, your story was also something like this. You were an engineer at first, right?
Yes, yes, very much. And it's funny. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and progress, because our original title was this, very like matter of fact. And then we got on a Zoom call earlier this week, and we started talking about this, and we started talking about this. First of all, if you don't subscribe to Gary's newsletter, it's great. And he just sent out recently an extremely long newsletter about cost cutting for vendors. It has a lot of really useful stuff there, super useful. So we started talking, and it kind of turned into more like this. We started talking about all the changes in the industry that are happening, and how it's really like renegotiating our relationships between engineers and vendors, and the bloodbath that's coming. And we actually think it's a great opportunity. Like, maybe back in engineers, we're always down for a little catastrophe. But like, I think it's really exciting, because I think that we've never really had to really articulate our value as engineers, or rather the muscles that we once had for doing so have withered over the past few years. So this is not the first time, though, that we've gotten these mandates like cut vendor spend, or rather like, how much are you spending? Like a decade and a half ago, the first time it was all about build versus buy, right? And I feel like the buy side really won that debate. And now that the question has come into is more like, nobody's going to build anymore, because we know how expensive that is. But it's more like, are we going to buy, or are we going to try and find a cheaper version of the service, or are we going to try and run an open source version ourselves? All of this happened before, so all happen again. And the world has changed too, right? Like, there's so many more tools you can buy now. We've gotten so much better at running cross-platform systems in general. And like, I don't know, how many of you were around in tech 15 years ago? Do you remember the army of engineers that we had to employ to run a simple app? Like, you had to have people who could rack and stack servers, run your mail, train your spam assassin and your clam antivirus, everything. God, when I was at Linden Lab making Second Life, we had hundreds of engineers. Today it would have been like, tens of engineers. And I feel like this is something that we sometimes look past, is just how much more effective and efficiently we run our systems now that we've embraced vendors, because we're able to focus a lot better. We spend way more, we have to hire fewer people, and we spend way more of their cycles focused on our core differentiators, like what it is that makes you, what it is that makes me. And so I briefly, just kind of as preface, I wanted to run through, I feel like there are like 5 categories of time, things that you spend your time on as engineers. Like the first one is like the happy place, right? Like you're making tangible progress towards business goals. Then there's like the keep the lights on work, which is what infrastructure is typically known for, right? There's the sort of glue work. There's the shit that you have to do to get in order to get the shit that you need to do. A lot of this comes down to trying to get your code to work, or reproducing your bugs, or fixing CI/CD, or why did this deploy fail? And if you try and like what a lot of this has in common is just like it comes down to trying to understand and work within your system. And then there's firefighting, which is obviously the worst one because it wakes you up or interrupts you and forces context switches. So like I said, like I feel like one of the enormous and somewhat inherited victories is just like how much keep the lights off engineering work we have just like eliminated. So let's talk about like, what does a great vendor feel like after that preface? What is it like to work with a vendor that is compatible with you?
So now you're looking at me, Cherry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, one thought about the vendor, like as an engineer, like we do use tons of vendors, but I never thought of vendors. Like, for example, in GitHub, it's a vendor, right? But like to me, when I say vendor, to me, it's like this company that we kind of like sign a contract with something. And to me, like GitHub doesn't feel like a vendor because we just use it. It's just Git. And there's a lot of like self-service vendors where like technically it is a vendor, but you just kind of use it. The same thing when you're using, like you might be using like Bugsnag or Sentry or anything. And when like those are all vendors, but to me, there's like 2 types of vendors that I differentiate in my head. One is the one that I just use, typically the self-service things. And a good vendor there, the question is, what does a good tool feel like? It just gets the job done. You don't think about it.
Yes.
You just use it all the time. And
What?
then there's the other vendor, which feels to me like a vendor. Like when I worked at Uber, I use all these tools that I didn't think too much of it. Some was internal tools, some of it was, GitHub, some of it was something else. But then there's the kind of the vendors that you like sign a contract with. And I'll give you an example. On the payments team, we signed a contract with Adyen and Braintree and a bunch of other payment providers. And we kind of worked with them. We had meetings with them, and we knew that we paid them a bunch of money and they had to do something. And then there's this kind of like specialized vendor, I guess, which was unique to us. And we had a lot of relationship with them. And like, honestly, like some of them was like not great because it was just frustrating. Like they had outages and it woke us up, and it was just bad because we didn't want to be woken up. And then there was the ones where we kind of got to know them a little bit, like kind of talked every now and then because of work, not because we wanted to. Like I didn't care too much to talk, but we kind of understand where they were coming from. And they were kind of respectful. And I'll give you an example. Back in the day, Paytm was a vendor in India. They were payments provider. They're a really big company. They had an outage, and we were a bit upset because we noticed this outage. And then we asked them like, hey, can you send over a postmortem? And they kind of got on a call with us, their engineers, and we talk with their engineers. So to me, a good vendor relationship is when, as an engineer, I get to talk with the engineer, not with the account manager, not with this email thing. So, like I think there's these 2 categories. Like one is just a tool, it works, and that's it. You don't think about it. And then when you work with them, you actually, as an engineer, I get to talk to an engineer when I have a problem.
Like I feel like I didn't really understand this until I was at Facebook. And then I realized just like, there are teams at Facebook who are building like, the edge proxy. And oh, and by the way, if y'all have questions, please don't feel like you have to wait till the end, like drop them in the chat and we'll talk about them. But we would use their tech. If we had a problem, we would file a ticket for them or whatever. And I realized that like, when you're dealing with a good vendor, it feels like you're just two teams at a big company. And when you're at a big company and you're dealing with a good team, it feels like you're dealing with a good software vendor, right? Like you should feel like your values are aligned. You should feel like, there's some transparency. And so like when you're trying to figure out, am I compatible with this vendor or not? I think you can ask yourself a lot of the same questions that you would ask if you were like trying to give them a performance review. Like, do they share their postmortems? Are they transparent about things? Do they overpromise? You should, like, first of all, if it's core technology for you, you should make sure you understand their architecture. Are they happy to talk through it with you? Do they make claims that cannot possibly be true based on what you know of technology, right? Like I always trust vendors that are willing to tell me bad news, especially bad things about them. That just makes my heart like flutter. There's also, I should just write a blog post and put all these checklist things, but it's like, you want to ask things like, you want to make sure that your workload is core to them, not just like a niche, like a side thing or a feature that doesn't get used very much. You want to ask questions about how you compare to other customers of theirs. You want to know if you're like going to be their biggest customer, or if you're like, and if your workloads have any outliers and stuff. Not as long as you trust each other, and as long as they're both forthcoming and believable about how the kind of like problems that they expect to see. And to kind of Gary's point, it's really, it's almost like a litmus test. If not, I wouldn't sign that contract, honestly.
Okay, was Charity breaking up for other people or was it just me?
Oh no. Am I back?
Yes.
All right, great.
Okay, but you said something about a litmus test? And I did not catch what that litmus test was.
Great. Thanks, Jess. I think that's a bit of a litmus test. If you cannot talk to an engineer on the vendor side when you need to, I wouldn't sign that contract. I really do think that Gergely was onto something there. You need to be able to talk to them.
Well, I guess, one thing that's hard about this, because I think you're clearly talking about like, you've been a vendor, right, for a while. Like this is what you do, and you're trying to really do well with engineers. But the tricky thing is, as an engineer, it felt to me a lot of times, and I'll talk about my time at Uber, we didn't decide on vendors. Like, someone signed that contract. Now, later when I was an engineering manager, I did have a little bit of a say. So it turns out the way vendor contracts are typically negotiated is our team or company has a problem. We identify we should work with the vendor. In this case, we needed a payments processor, or the developer, the DevX team will decide that they need, someone to either they'll self-host Git or they'll use some sort of, GitHub or GitLab or whatnot. So anyway, higher ups, the product manager, engineering manager, or director decide we need a vendor, and then you choose one. Now, if you're working, it kind of goes back to the culture of your company. If you're working in a super open company, for example, at Uber, we were pretty open. The product manager was like, all right, we're going to sign up with a new payment provider, and we're in the selection process. And then engineers could kind of put up their hands and say, if they wanted to be involved or not. But the problem is that a lot of times you're kind of, the vendor is there, the contract is in place.
Totally.
And
totally.
I got stuck with vendors where
totally.
like, you don't figure out that can I talk with an engineer or not until it's later. So I think this is more important for engineering decision makers, whoever's making that decision. If you're either a manager in this call.
And if you're an engineer and you get the option of whether or not to be involved in this decision, be involved in this decision. It's good for you. It's good for the process. It's good for everyone. I honestly think that vendor engineering is the single highest leverage form of engineering that any senior engineer can do. Because think of it, you are leveraging the work of tens, hundreds, thousands of engineers for a price tag with some very small amount of blue code. This is why platform engineering is so traditionally. Really? Fuck. God damn it, monkey brains.
So it's true that it is true that it's high leverage, vendor engineering, if you want it to be but there's a big problem with this, and you all know this from your time at Facebook. You don't get promoted for selecting an amazing vendor. You get promoted for building.
You should. This is a lesson for leaders. Like, I feel like people keep getting promoted for building the flashiest, like most complicated things. I have a real bone to pick with the idea of, that as your level increases, your scope must increase. We wrote a whole blog post about this. That's so fucking bogus, because what do you want your senior engineers to do? You want them to constantly work to reduce scope creep and to like make the narrowest, smallest, decision or solution possible. And if you have a job ladder that just rewards massive scope creep, it's a huge problem. I really feel like people should be refactoring their job ladders to take advantage of the fact that the highest leverage work that any engineer can do is not working.
Yeah, I agree with it. Like, I feel that, I would compare this with a senior engineer or staff engineer, or any engineer being involved in a merger and acquisition. Like, I think it's a given when your company is thinking of buying a startup, you're going to pull in your engineers and you're going to do your due diligence. Like, if any of you on this call have been involved, the way it works is you meet their team, you look at their code, you ask the questions, you ask, how are you doing CI/CD, security analysis, yada, yada, yada. And now companies do this when they buy a company or because they're planning. You should do this with your vendor. So I think a big lesson to me, because I do agree that the world there's vendors everywhere. And I don't think we're doing due diligence as engineering managers. Engineers are not doing it because I think often they're not involved and it's a bit too late and we've signed the contract and you're stuck with whatever. But I think, great tech companies, the engineering manager would tell the product manager, whoever's making the decision, like, all right, I'm going to pull in my engineers as well,
Totally.
and we're going to decide together. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to add this to the job ladder that alongside, shipping code and doing architecture, evaluating vendors, reevaluating them, and making pragmatic decisions, it should be rewarded.
Absolutely. This is this is the theme, right? There's a lot of opportunity here for us to make our systems better. This is not just about choosing vendors or managing spend. This is about recognizing our value, getting better at adjusting our socio-technical systems to reward different kinds of value. So there's a question here. What do you do when staff engineers make a recommendation and leadership ignores their thoughts? Well, you have a few options. Number one, get a job where leadership doesn't ignore your thoughts. Number two, maybe they didn't ignore your thoughts. Maybe they had reasons that they didn't tell you. So it's worth asking before you assume. Number three, my favorite, if their choice turns out to be the wrong one, constantly point it out and so that the next time that they will listen to you. Lucas, you said something about it does not vibe well when you update the ladder. Say more about that.
Well, I think that organization-wise, like people evaluate seniority of the engineers by the complexity that they can handle, and that kind of indirectly leads to that implicit scope creep. So trying to aim for simplicity is in conflict with the expectations of seniority by people.
Gotcha.
So that's one thing that's kind of hard for me to navigate. And
That's
also apologies for the lack of video.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to be conscious of time. We have a lot to get through. Yeah, no, you're right. These are not quick fixes typically. There's a lot of stuff that's deeply ingrained into our engineering culture and into the way that we think about things. And it's a good opportunity. Like, I feel like these pricing conversations are the tip of the spear that force us to reevaluate a lot of our deeply held beliefs about the world. And I think that one of the biggest ones is we still tend to believe that our time has no value, or we act as though it has no value, or we act as though its value can't be quantified and can't be compared with other sources of value. Engineers need to get, and engineering managers and engineering directors need to get so much better at converting their labor into dollar signs. Engineers get super hung up on being accurate. Don't give a shit about being accurate. Be in the ballpark, within, take a page from your business peers and be within the right order of magnitude so that you can have a conversation, make a decision, and move on. And then next time around, you can improve on your guesses. But if what you're being told is, cut vendor spend by 50%, and there's no correlating discussion about, headcount or what are we cutting and is it helping or hurting us? You can spend money that will save you money you could spend money that's just lighting it on fire. And like just talking about dollar signs really is letting the real questions just completely off the hook.
So
All right,
speaking of dollar signs, let's talk about pricing.
let's talk about pricing and packaging for developer tools.
Don has a question specifically about if you're a smaller company and enterprise pricing is not public, how do you get the information you need?
If you're a smaller company.
Yeah, if you're a small company and you're not expert negotiators, how do you know you're getting the right deal when you do have to negotiate?
Right deal is incredibly subjective.
Okay, well, I made that up, but he specifically said, how do you ensure that you're not being taken advantage of from a pricing point of view?
Well, this, okay, that's a bigger question. We can circle back to that later. A lot of it comes down to, so something that our sales team will often say is never do a deal that you wouldn't do both sides of. Like if you wouldn't feel good about buying on these terms, then don't sell on those terms. You want to be in business with people who feel the same way, right?
So
I
I would take a step back on pricing. Like when I was at Uber, like, there's two ways to do pricing. One is like you just look at how much the price tag is, and then you're trying to get a good deal or get it cheaper or whatever. I think that's a bad way to look at it. Like what at Uber, we used to do manual testing of our builds every single week. So every week we cut a new build and we had to test all the payments flows, all the 14 payments flows on iOS and on Android. And engineers did that. There were like, I think 15 of us. So every Thursday for an hour, we would do it. And we hated it. We hated our lives. It was so bad. And so I was the manager of the team and I needed to make a business case to hire someone. So what I did is I kind of wrote up, how much does this cost the company? Just our hourly wages. And then it came out to something like $200,000 per year. And then I was like, all right, we have a budget. So if we can find, so if, and that's my point is, a lot of times, I don't think most people do this. We did this because we were so damn frustrated. And then we went to vendors and one of us quoted us $50,000 for a year. The other one gave us 150,000. And I didn't really care at that point. I think we went with 150K, by the way, in the end. But I was like, look, like whichever we do, we're saving a bunch of money. And I'd much rather, do the one that means that we never have to do it. So we actually got a crowd testing solution that had they actually did a better job than us. So what we did is not only are we saving time, but they're doing a better job.
They're doing a better job because it's their one job to do this and to be the best in the world.
But I think with pricing, as long as you don't know how much it costs you, it's kind of moot point. You can go there and you can get a discount, but are you overpaying or not? You don't know because you don't know what's the value. And that's one. And I think you should really have it is worth pricing.
You're jumping ahead to the end,
of you doing it. Sorry.
But that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Back of the envelope math says that 5 engineers for a year costs $1 million. So if it takes a team of 5, that's $1 million budget. So there are really two kinds of pricing in developer tools. There's your free tier and there's production pricing, and there's not much in between. We are big fans of usage-based pricing. In fact, I think Gergely and I we're joking about, I really think that per seat pricing is going to turn out to be an zero interest rate phenomenon. Because
okay, what does that mean?
It means that when money was free, you could charge per seat because nobody's really paying attention to price tags, but you can't actually correlate it to value of any sort. And per seat pricing is it's an abomination because what you want is for a good tool is for people to use it more. You want for people to share it. When only a couple people in your org can use a tool, that creates a silo. People are going to start hacking around it in all kinds of shitty ways, like password sharing or whatever. And can you blame them? It doesn't cost the vendor anymore to add a couple of fucking seats. But the way I feel like they come up with this pricing is they work backwards from their valuation. Literally, they go, okay, we raised at this price, therefore our revenue targets are this price, therefore we have to price here. It's fucked, and you shouldn't stand for it.
How do you really feel, Charity?
Sorry. So like, I feel like a lot of us, is this the right slide? We tend to feel like we want to pay as little as possible, right? That's a very natural response. And maybe you do, maybe you don't. I tend to think that if it's not in your critical path, it's not something that is core to your success as a business, pay as little as possible. Get the $50 tier, great. But if you are relying on it in the way that like we rely on Amazon or, the infrastructure that we need to succeed as a business, you don't actually want to be nickel and diming it. You want to make sure that you are paying them enough that if you value their service, you want them to value your business. You want to have a say in the roadmap. You want your feedback to be solicited. You want to matter to them. If what they're charging you is so little that you're like, how can they possibly run a business on these numbers? Well, guess what? They probably haven't figured out how to run a business on these numbers. And they're probably, Parse did this, right? Amazing free tier, never built a business. What happened? They got bought by Facebook and they got shut down, right? If they're charging more than you think they could possibly cost to run the service, then likely they're either like pricing because they have to justify their valuation, or they have very inefficient internal operations, or they're just trying to soak you. None of these are good, right? Like Gergely was saying, you should know, like if you do the math to be like, how much do we feel like it would cost us to build and run this? And then, map that to what it costs. Like it should be in the same ballpark. And if they're trying to charge you too little, like it's really tempting to just sign on the dotted line and move production and stuff. But like that can actually be even scarier. So you really want to understand why. Did you have
charging too little, it might be unsustainable?
It might be unsustainable. It might be it might be that they haven't figured out how to monetize it. It might be that your use case is kind of a niche, not really supported, or they might be thinking of deprecating it, or it might just not be, mainstream what they do.
Or they're trying to get you locked in.
That's the other big thing. You see this a lot with companies that are, I'm not going to name any names, but ones who are like, they've got a whole bunch of products and they want to give you a bunch for free so that you get locked in, so that it's really hard for you to leave. Or it's a loss leader, like New Relic. Sorry, I pulled this scam. Sorry, I don't care. Where they got everybody locked in, and then they just janked the prices, and it was really, people were stuck paying them because they couldn't move off in time, and that's just so deeply unethical.
I want to hear some stories from Gergely. Have you experienced some of these?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, I think one thing that is important to add as an engineer or someone is you just want to do your research. Like for the most part, yes, you can estimate how much it costs you to build. And actually, when you're big enough, it might be viable. At Uber, we did this. Honestly, the danger of doing so is usually you underestimate it. You just kind of calculate how much it costs for like an engineer to do it for like, I don't know, like build this thing for 2 months and that's your price, but actually it's going to be more. But that happens, and most companies luckily no longer have the luxury to always do this. Although sometimes it does make sense, especially with open source solutions, you hosting it, as long as you're realistic of how much it will actually take. Just calculate the maintenance, the regular updates, the context switching, just the same way as you would estimate how long it'll actually take something to build. Get your estimate multiplied by 2 and you'll probably have a reasonable number. So just be realistic of how much it'll actually cost you, and then get alternatives from other vendors, because as long as you only have one vendor, you're kind of, it doesn't really matter like if they give you good price or not, you're not really going to have leverage. So I think it's a little bit similar to, when how do you maximize my salary? The way you maximize your salary is get different offers. If you only have one offer, you might get lucky. So if you only have one vendor, again, you might get lucky. Maybe they're starting out or something, but you kind of want to get a sense of where the market is. And we're not going to be talking about like vendors that are, we don't know. We're going to be talking about like logging vendors or Honeycomb is an observable 11Y vendor.
Ollie.
Exactly, but you have competitors and people can compare, and you look at feature sets, and then you also talk with a team. So I think it's kind of a package. It's not by itself. It's a little bit like buying a car, right? Like there's no such thing as I want a cheap car. You have a budget, you know what you're looking for, if you want a full wheel drive or an electronic vehicle, and then you kind of look around. And this is why, like, it's not that simple, but when you get a sense of this, I think it's easier. And then I would suggest, one thing I wish I would have done more is just get engineers involved a bit more in the decision. When we had engineers involved before we signed a deal, especially with a bigger one, I think we just got a better understanding of what we're getting. Maybe, like, price is usually not on engineering sides. Usually you have a budget, and honestly, the cost of your engineers is usually a lot more than your vendor cost. So I didn't really worry too much about this as an engineering manager. I think this is typically a director or VP level. But again, like, our point was we wanted to have a reliable partner. And of course, there's this thing that price doesn't matter until it does, because right now, the uncomfortable truth is that a lot of companies are coming around and telling, we've seen it in the chat as well, people said, but I hear it a lot, is like, slash your prices by X%, or your vendor cost, but that's something else. But yeah, it's like, it's hard because it's not just a box that doesn't exist. It's a relationship as well.
There was a great point made by Dan up above, where he pointed out, so a couple other things that we didn't mention that are important about pricing: predictability, being able to forecast your spend. I feel like predictability and transparency are almost as important as the price itself. Because
does that transparency include any sort of, do you have to get into multiple vendor enterprise negotiation agreements to even know what another vendor would cost?
I'm just talking about while you're using the service, there should be transparency into how the prices are calculated, so that you can predict what your usage is going to be, and you can predict what your costs are going to be. There was also a great tip in Gergely's newsletter from one of his readers that said that if you're spending over $10,000 on a vendor, you can expect a discount.
Yeah, I think someone said, which I agree, like, if it's above $10,000, everything is negotiable. Like, if at that point you're not like, first of all, they're going to talk to you for that much money, like, someone is going to talk to you, and you'll be able to pull things. And it might not just be asking for less money, it might be asking for more flexibility for if you're seat-based, additional seats, right? Like, okay, I know we don't like it, but it's a reality. It might be to get a consultation with their engineers. It can be a lot of things, but you are a valued customer, and that $10,000, that magical mark, companies, like, even the large companies, I'm now reading a lot of public reports from tech companies, but companies typically list the number of their customers above spending about $10,000 per year, because that is that thing. So every single vendor, like, you can actually have a relationship with them, and you can use that for a bunch of things. You can lock in multi-year savings or whatever you want to.
That made a great point, though, that there are services like vendor that will negotiate on your behalf and offer you discounts in exchange for, like, a cut of the proceeds, which is something kind of new and kind of cool. Anyway, let's talk about managing costs. Actually, as we were saying earlier, really starts with understanding your value. And this is something that we have historically not been good at as an industry. And I think we've both ranted about this on Twitter many times. And I, for one, am excited that the motivation and the impetus is now here for us all to get better at this, because I feel like it's super overdue. And a lot of this comes back to, not all of your time is created equally. It's not just about knowing the dollar amount of, each hour that you spend. It's about, like, the hours that you want to maximize are that first category, right? The ones where you're making visible progress towards, actual company goals. If you can minimize that, keep the lights out, the KTLO work, if you can minimize the amount of time that you spend floundering, honestly, I feel like anything that you can do, if you can pay money to speed up the amount of time between when you're writing the code and when it's live in production, or when something breaks and when you understand it, that money is almost never poorly spent. It almost always makes up for itself. You can do calculations about the value of uptime and downtime, just like you can about, the value of your own time. But I think it's super important to also just recognize, like, what you spend that time on is meaningful too. And even if it doesn't, actually save you time, but it makes the ratio of the kind of work that you get to do better, that's huge.
Well, and also, just like, if you go back to that one, like, here's a really important thing that me and Cherry were talking about. We kind of started this whole thing, and the reason I kind of got a bit more involved here is we started with, like, how can I I'll like my thinking was like, all right, we're going to talk about how can I save on vendors, right? Like, let's start with that. Now, that's a very simple thing, but let's say that's our goal. Now, to understand how to save on vendors, you want to understand how much, the vendor costs. Can I save something? But the better way is to understand how much value the vendor gives you. Now, to do that, you need to understand how much value your team generates. So actually, I think what a lot of what you were saying, Charity, but I'm just going to make it really clear. I think a lot of engineering teams, like if you're an engineering manager or if you're an engineer working on your team, you should have an idea how much money does your team generate, either money generated or cost reduced, or indirectly doing all of these things. Like if you're not directly generating money, you're going to be helping other teams. Maybe you'll help like multiple teams generate a bunch of things. But as soon as you can project a money value on your team's work, like your teams, forget about the vendors, you're going to be in a much stronger position for multiple reasons. First of all, if the company will ever do cost cutting, they're going to take the cost centers, which are the teams that are not making money, they're actually spending money. And it's nice to know, like, first of all, hopefully this will not happen, but there's a little bit more chance right now, but it's nice to know where you are, like just to, it's better to know than
Even
to not
just
know.
going through the exercise is incredibly valuable for you, just when it comes to like thinking about how to prioritize your time and where it goes. And like in some this kind of exercise is always wrong, but it's just kind of going through it that's super valuable. I also
And it also gives you the vocabulary. Once you can talk about your work, you can now talk about, once I don't know, our team is making $500,000 and this project will bring in $100,000. It's so much easier for you to either make a case for a vendor or know that this is out of scope. Like if you need a vendor that's $500,000 and you realize your whole team is bringing in less value than that, well, maybe you either build it in house or maybe you don't need it. Like
you should
I
work on higher value, higher leverage stuff.
Yeah.
I've often said in the past that like SLOs are like APIs for your engineering team, but I feel like being able to speak the language of dollars is actually the API for engineering teams, for business units and for decision makers. And our inability to articulate and just like think about our work in those terms really holds us back. Whenever I'm hearing managers just like complaining about how they can't convince the product team to let them spend time decreasing the build and deploy pipeline, I'm like, explain it to them in terms that they understand, right? And dollar signs, unfortunately, are the global Esperanto.
So dollar sign, I agree with you. Like as soon as you can talk especially as an engineering manager, like someone who is like making a case for your team, for your headcount, if you can talk dollar signs, you can make a case to hire people, to take over other teams, for a lot of things. Now, I'm not saying you need to do that all the time, but I will say this: if you cannot translate your work into dollar signs in a rough way, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to be as successful as that person next to you who can. And I guarantee. So, and here's a really interesting thing: most software engineers who are becoming really experienced and really talented, they will naturally gravitate towards platform teams, because that's where they can do more complex work. And in a lot of company kind of levels and competencies, that's how they can be promoted to the next level.
The highest leverage work. Absolutely.
The highest leverage work. But platform teams are the hardest ones to actually turn into what is a dollar sign. Now, if you're on a platform team as a manager or a leader and you can translate it, you're sorted.
I strongly disagree, but I don't think we have time for that argument.
All right. Next time. Sorry.
So I know this has been very like sort of big picture, like less, specific. So I wanted to kind of like wind down with some very specific, just rules of thumb, things that we've found useful. Like infra, always your biggest bill. Observability, and not because I'm a vendor, but like is always number 2. And it usually seems to be about 20 to 25% of your infra bill. Open source tools are a great option for many things. The way I would think about is open source an option for you or not. And I'm someone who, last time I was running systems, I was violently bigoted against vendors, irony of ironies, and I insisted on running everything myself. So,
Was this at Parse when you were
at Parse? I ran I ran Nagios and Ganglia, in fact, for our graphs and monitoring and alerting. What was I saying? Right. I would say these days, it's this day and age, 2 things. If it's in your production critical path, think harder about using an open source solution, just because the cost for you to maintain and run and everything is going to be a lot higher. If you have high reliability requirements and extremely, can't be down, you're going to be paged in the middle of the night for it. You need to do extra engineering to make sure it stays up, right? That's just a much bigger time commitment and a lot more interruptions than if it's something like, task tracking or something that can be down for a little bit. The second thing I think is, when evaluating whether or not to sign on to run yet another open source tool, look at your keep the lights on work. Is like 10 or 20% of your time going to that work? Great, spin up another tool or two. Is like, 60 or 70% of your time going to that work? Hell no. You cannot afford to be running any more infrastructure. And if your personal like infrastructure or keep the lights on work level is low, make sure that it's not low just because you're shuffling it all off into someone else's team before you decide that you can afford to do more. But this one thing that I kind of buried here in the middle is really buried the lead here, because I feel like
Sherry, just a quick one, because I just want to emphasize, I think it's super like, okay, there's a few things people can take away, but one thing I would suggest that people take away is, if you're on a team as an engineer and manager, know how much you spend on keep the lights on. Just figure that out. Forget about dollars. Just figure out what percentage, how many interruptions. Just be honest with yourself. Once you have that, you'll be in a lot better shape for any decision, not just vendor decisions.
Yeah, always track interruptions, like the number of times that people are getting paged, especially during the night. You want to know your baseline, and you want an early warning sign if it starts trending up. I think that's one of the most important. It's right up there with the DORA metrics, right? 4 DORA metrics, and track how often your people are getting woken up and like interrupted. But I feel like the moral of the story, writ large, is fewer, better vendors with more investment into the relationship with the ones that you have. Right? I feel like we need to stop just sort of spray and praying, signing up for this vendor and that vendor, and well, this vendor's kind of the same, but these people on the team really like it. Nobody wants to learn a different tool, so we'll just pay for both of them, right? Like those days are over. You need to think seriously about, like, what is my critical path? What are the absolute things that support me making money and existing as a business, and really invest in those relationships. And then, scrap a bunch of other tools. I really feel like this is a huge opportunity. There's going to be a bit of a bloodbath, and the correction is good. Pain comes from the concentrated pace of it. But like Gergely was talking about this at length when we were talking about just that, a big part of this is be like Amazon. Don't wait for the correction to come to actually get a handle on your cost and how much and where your money is going.
Yeah, and just to give a little context on Cherry, so I ran this survey asking people what's up with vendor costs, and like everyone was saying, like, all right, we're being told to save 20%, 30%, 50% on our vendor costs. And then I also asked a question of like, do you have, so some people had targets, some people didn't. And there was like a few people who said, it's just like it's always been. And they were all working at Amazon and AWS. So it turns out that at Amazon, every single year or every 6 months, they do this exercise. They've always been doing it, even in the kind of good years. So I think the takeaway is, like, for a lot of you will be doing this exercise, which is uncomfortable, and you have to justify if you need the vendors, you're going to cut the excess usage and all that. But you should be doing this every 6 to 12 months. Be like Amazon, and don't stop after things will get back to kind of normal. And Amazon, it would just let you business as usual. They were like, yeah, nothing has changed. We're still lean. We always have been. And it's interesting because Amazon is not always like they do a lot of good things, and they do some things that I think are questionable. But this is definitely a good thing.
Yeah,
I think
the regular reviews are one thing, but I also feel like cost is a indistinguishable part of architecture and building, and yet it's one that we have not treated it as a first-class citizen. And for most of my career, right? How often have you been in an architect, like building out a feature or something, and been like, okay, what about my cross-region network traffic? Like, let's analyze the cost before we commit to this, or let's look at our replication model. And I feel like this is something that, like, learning this, developing this sense is going to it's going to be a little bit difficult, but it's going to make you better engineers. It's going to make you build better systems. It's going to give you, a sixth sense for, it's just the fact that we've just been like slapping things together is such an artifact of data centers. Really, it's like, well, I've got this capacity, put it wherever. But in fact, where you put things really matters for efficiency.
All right, thank you. I would like to do some more AMA. So people put your questions in the Q&A, and we have a few minutes. Dawn, I'm going to come back to yours because you had one already.
Thank you. I actually realized I have a different question, but I might have two if we have time.
Right.
So we're going through some economic changes that are definitely driving cost saving, but I think there's actually an incredibly powerful undercurrent that I think basically no engineers are aware of, that I think is going to really change engineering behavior across the entire industry. And I thought maybe we could talk about it, which is the change in the tax law. How many people here know about this and how it is destroying software P&Ls right now?
Gergely, tell us about it.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't talked about much in public, but I've been alerted to this, like especially with bootstrappers. I mean, I'm not sure we'll have time to go into it, but the short of it is, going forward, software costs cannot be accounted in the same financial year as they're spent, which has been the case. They have to be spread over 5 years, which is a huge tax cash flow burden for every company that's not making basically millions in profits per year, or like multiple times your profits of your expenses. And it's a huge problem. There's been a big CNN article on it, which that's how it hit mainstream as far as I'm aware. I think everyone has their heads scratched at the definitely at the bootstrap one companies, definitely, and most kind of medium up to medium sized companies. But yeah, I don't have an answer on this.
Well, I think the way that
will
this
probably hit vendor costs as well.
Well, I think it actually is going to be maybe surprising that way, in that all of the things that we would historically say, oh, we're going to run that internally ourselves, which are now going to be accounted for over a 5-year amortization schedule. If we vendor it, we can expense it in the year. So I expect we're going to get tremendous pressure as engineering teams from our finance teams to stop doing a bunch of things internally and start vendoring them.
Okay, great.
Charity's like, that sounds great for me.
Yes. Joshua has a question about quotas. Like when we're talking about predictability of vendor costs, reserved instances, capacity per day, is this a significant issue with trying to estimate costs? He asks.
Sorry, quotas? I don't understand.
Like when you have to set up reserved instances, or your capacity per day, or your number of events per month, for instance.
Is this an issue for anyone but Amazon?
I mean, we have like events per month at Honeycomb, right?
Sorry, I don't know.
This is totally a thing that I can speak to this a little bit if you want.
Great. This is Ian Smith. He's a manager on our platform team.
Our SRE team, actually, and we look a lot at very close platform domain. We look a lot actually at knowing what we're going to be spending down the road. We've mostly not had problems with. We've never really had a problem with, hey, we signed a contract with a vendor. We said we're going to use X. We actually need X times 1.5 or X times 0.8. Like vendors are generally willing to work with you on that. But there is sort of this question of like, what do you model and how? So what are we using today? What do we think our growth looks like? And how deep down that rabbit hole do you want to go? So one of my employees just spent a couple months doing this as part of a big vendor negotiation. And we kind of said, okay, there are basically 3 bits of growth here that we care significantly about. Everything else is just noise. There are 3 things that we can predict based on what finance tells us about sales, how that's lined up in the past to our usage of Amazon, actually. And then we can say, okay, we expect in the next year we're going to see this kind of growth in compute. And so you can ask those questions of yourselves and say, how big is this contract? How much do I want to spend on making that projection perfectly accurate? And how much do I want to sort of do a back of the envelope thing and say this is not a big enough spend that is critical to get it, absolutely precise. Is that sort of what you're looking for there?
I'll go with it. Yeah, and it gets back to what Gergely said earlier about, as an engineer, we have to let go of, these are questions about the future that we can't answer with perfect accuracy, but we don't need perfect accuracy. How much time do we want to spend getting it more accurate? And at some point it's good enough.
Right, exactly. At some point, sometimes it's going to be, this is a gut check. Sometimes it's going to be, this is closer to accurate, and it's always going to be somewhere in between there. But you just have to go with what feels right in terms of the value of the contract and the value of the time that you're going to spend building that model out.
Thanks. John has had a question in here for a while about more strategies to measure where your team is spending time. Like, where is that KTLO, keep the lights on time investment coming from?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I did, but here's the thing: there's not really good ways to do it. Like, there's a few things, right? Like when you're using ticketing systems, sometimes you can use that data and you can feed it in depending on how much your team is using it. A lot of the times when I put together like these reports, I kind of like did a spot check where either I asked people to, well, first of all, I got some data, but that data is not really gonna, even if you use a ticketing system that tracks, unless you work at it. So there's two types of software companies. There's ones which track your time down to the minute, some consultancies, and I see Ian is clapping there. You can probably tell this, but it's a terrible place to work at as an engineer, because you're harassed for not entering the time, but you have this tracking. The other one, which I think is a more sane engineering teams, where people just do the work, they work on tickets. And here it's down to the engineering manager or the manager to kind of do a bit of extra work. And I did this with a mix of looking at some data that we might have had, like from some of the ticketing system, but more importantly, talking with the engineers, looking at the projects that we're talking on and keeping track of what people actually worked on. And a lot of the work is not logged. When people wake up in the middle of the night or they stay overtime to work on something, it's not there. So I kind of talk with them and got this together, and it was never, I didn't have anything that automated this.
It's almost like you're a dynamic sampling profiler.
Honestly, like, I think
I love it. Yes.
Qualitative feedback is good enough, as long as you're asking them pretty quick. Like, don't ask people, what have you spent your time on over the past quarter? But if you're asking people like every other week or so, like, how much time did you spend in these various, categories this week? There will be some like biases, but if you're tracking that week over week, you'll have a good baseline. You'll see when it's going up or down.
Yes, and I love the dynamic tracking and the week over week. So if you have a one-on-one, you're like, just figure out, I want to figure out this much, just for 1 or 2 weeks, ask people to tell you roughly where they spend their time, and you're telling them this is not for, just tell people this is for their own good. And so I always told people, please tell me all the stuff you've been working on, because I really want to know. And then I went back to my leadership and
it's not that you're being judged about whether you're doing the right thing. I was like,
I'm on your side.
So I can advocate for you.
And then I went to my manager or my director. I said, we're spending 25% of our time keeping the lights on. They were like, what? We're like, yeah. And because that's how much it was. But if I would have looked at the data, it would have said like 5%, because people were not logging that stuff.
Oh, which gets to Troy's question of, outside of general cost estimations of engineering time, because that's absolutely a minimum of what it's costing us to do stuff. How else can engineering managers advocate for budget for developer tools? Can we bring them around to this focus thing?
We are like 30 seconds from being out of time. But like my what I said in chat was, get as many people to read Accelerate, or even the beginning of it as possible, especially on your business side. If you can get your head of finance, your COO or whatever to read it, I feel like all kinds of things will open in front of you, because it has data, it has research, and it really lays the case out so unequivocally. Whatever. All right. Thank you all so much for coming. This was really fun. Thanks, Gergely.
Thank you, everyone.
I just want to say it's Charity's birthday today, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
So we can all wish her a happy birthday. And
Okay, everybody unmute. Ready? Happy birthday in 3. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Charity.
Happy birthday.
All right. You'll all get an email when the recording is available. Thank you.
Thank you.